Hey, welcome to another episode of the WP Crowd. Today we are talking about WordPress and the enterprise realm. Should be a good show, but first let me do some introductions. James, why don't you go first?
I'm James Tryon, founder of Easily Amuse. It's a full-service creative boutique and lead ambassador of Wapoos.
Nice. And Carl?
I'm Carl Alexander. I'm a PHP developer. I write about object-oriented programming and WordPress at carlalexander.ca. And that's pretty much it.
All right. So today, as I said, we're talking about WordPress and Enterprise. As most of you people know, I actually work in an enterprise company, pretty fortune. I mean, we're a Fortune 10 company, at least a Fortune 100 company, and in the enterprise using WordPress currently. But I feel like we're not common. It's not common to see it. It's way more common than it used to be. Back, even going back, a couple of years. So I think it's slowly getting adopted into the enterprise realm. Sometimes more so just for like administrative tools, so behind the scenes, internal stuff. But I'm curious how we can improve that statistic because a couple of weeks ago I talked to Joe here on the podcast about WordPress developers getting paid considerably less than the average of other developers, and it seemed like the stem of that came from enterprise. Like, if WordPress isn't getting enterprise level work, which ultimately is, the highest paid, highest profitable, then ultimately there's not going to be that much money doing WordPress work. So that's an issue. It's constantly a race or a competition for the mediocre, average, or low priced website. So I'm curious, James, you have an agency now. So have you done any enterprise work? And if you have, what challenges if you face trying to get it or while working with them?
Yeah, we've done quite a lot of enterprise work, but that was when we were teamed up with Valet. So we came in, we were working with Valet for several years. They're a great company, but we were working with them as we'd come in as a support team, and we sort of worked our way in. And once they became trusted with us, they would continue to give us more help. And that's sort of where most of our enterprise level work came from, is literally just working our way in from the bottom, helping with support and small tasks. Once they realized that we can do it, we were continuing to get more.
So I'm curious what kind of roadblocks or what kind of issues you might have faced, if any, while working with enterprise. I know you were more of a support role, but did you notice anything different compared to a non-enterprise client?
Yeah, a little bit. Well, I can say that enterprise work, when we were doing it, had a lot of, not always the case, but it had a lot more people involved, or had a lot more red tape, or a decision by committee of people who would have to approve work that has already been approved in the meeting, but then would have to be shown to a higher department that we wouldn't necessarily be talking to, or we'd have to wait for things to go through legal. So it was a little bit slower working with them. The one thing that I will say, that's not exactly what you're asking, but I will say that the biggest difference I noticed when we were working with enterprise is honestly, it's just what you were charging. I know if you didn't charge enough, you would even lose the deal because they had a certain amount they had to spend. So I do know several years ago we lost two contracts just simply because they weren't high enough. The proposal wasn't in their budget; it was under their budget. So that was an interesting discovery.
Yeah, it's always interesting because with budgets, budgets are a big thing in the enterprise because as soon as a team or a department doesn't spend their budget, they automatically get less the next year, which is typically something you see during like the end of year tax, end of year where they're like, okay, I got to spend all this money before we have to do the end of fiscal kind of stuff like that, where it's like, okay, next year we're gonna have to ask for money again. We got to make sure that we've, spent the same amount as our budget or more, just so we can prove that we need more money. So yeah, it's definitely something I've experienced in the past. I've worked at a couple different teams in my tenure or my time, and there's one team where it was more an agency model, and yeah, we dealt with that all the time, like working internally with other teams, building out their applications. The same thing. It was always, hey, let's coming in at the last second of the year for these projects, not necessarily to finish them, just to start them. And they were like, no, it has to be this much money, or we're going to go to a vendor instead, so, or an outside vendor. Carl, what do you think from like the development point of view? Like, do you think WordPress is capable of meeting the higher level needs of enterprise?
I mean, I worked with enterprise clients too, mostly the equivalent of, it's a company called Rogers in Canada. It's basically the equivalent of Time Warner. So lots of web publications, business. I was mostly working with business publications. The big difference with your two contexts was that we definitely had a race to the bottom because the publishing industry is really like struggling. So like they were very cost focused. So obviously WordPress was a really good solution for them for that, but we still were able to charge way above kind of average, but we never ran into situations where it's like, this is not expensive enough. Like it was mostly like, this is too expensive for what they were trying to do. But from a developer standpoint, I still think this is a bit of a recurring concept that I've brought up before, but I really think WordPress needs a kind of more stable version that enterprise can use with bug fixes and things like that. Because one thing with enterprise is that the cycle time is a lot slower. So you really need something like what I called before, like LTS, long-term support version of WordPress, where bug fixes are put in, but the rest, the new features and things like that aren't. And I think that's very important for the enterprise, because for them, like the cycle time for upgrades is like 6 months to a year to 2 years. It's not like whenever an update comes out.
Yeah, no, that's a huge factor because, we, as enterprise, we can't always be updating our software because there's other things that we want to focus our attention on, right? Like having a dedicated team just to, manage updates is resource, time, and money that's not spent creating new features or fixing existing features. So yeah, there's definitely something said there. So I know we've talked about LTS in the past, so I don't want to get too much into it, or like what WordPress can do as a platform to move forward into enterprise. We've talked about that before. So I kind of want to switch and talk more about like how we can combat some of the negativity that we face when it comes to WordPress, especially when you're trying to sell WordPress to enterprise. So a lot of that stems from the open source realm. Like enterprise, while it's definitely, again, not as bad as it used to be, there's still this notion that, okay, it's open source, therefore enterprise isn't going to want to use it. And open source has really been more adopted by the small businesses and startups, things like that. So let's just start with some of the more basic ones, I guess. Like, well, I guess overall, let's just start with an overarching. What do you guys think is a good way to just combat just the open source concept? Like, forget some of the more specific details, but if you were bidding on a project or talking to someone working in enterprise and they're like, we don't want to use open source software, what would you say back to them? What would you say to say, hey, you should be using open source because blank?
I'd be telling them, see ya. Like at this point, it's a bit of a, I mean, I've been a bit out of it for the last 5 years, but like the last 5 years has been like completely very drastic changes. Like, I mean, even in the .NET, like .NET to me is like, you know, the most enterprisey kind of platform out there. And then even .NET, like Microsoft has really embraced like .NET's technically open source now. Like it's just like a lot of it is open source, and it's just at this point you're kind of dealing with CIOs, CTOs, and
well, that's the problem is because, and I mean, I know you said like, you know, you'd walk away because they're not like in this day and age, we as like developers know that open source is kind of the
I'm
using open source.
Develop a JS app without open source. Like every enterprise client is going to want something JS. Like if you tell them I'm going to build something with React Native plus WordPress API, like what are you going to, like what are the alternatives for them to tell you? Like they can tell you don't use WordPress, use like a .NET backend, but really like, is there any commercial React Native equivalent that's as good?
Well, so that's an interesting point because I feel like things like React, I feel like libraries of code, React, Angular, Vue, definitely a conversation that's going on in the WordPress community currently that I don't want to get into, but JavaScript frameworks right now, I feel like they're more easily adopted and consumed. Like even, you know, one of our popular but kind of a little more legacy applications that we maintain is Backbone, which is an open source library. And I feel like Enterprise is much more easily to adopt one of those versus WordPress. Even if they're using it to build a WordPress, like I don't know Laravel community all that much, but I want to say that even that would be more easy to swallow for Enterprise. Like I feel like you get a higher chance of Enterprise saying yes to Laravel more than WordPress, even if they really just want you to build a CMS for their content.
Yeah, I don't know. That was a little tricky because I don't. Sure, there is the kind that people have they have to spend their budgets, or they're used to something else and they've already convinced their higher ups that they need this software that's $25,000 per user license, and they've already bought it and set it up, and trying to tie into that, it's a little difficult. And of course, the person who sold that to the company or the person who made that recommendation doesn't want to look foolish, or they already have they've already said this is what we're doing, that they weren't necessarily fully educated. So sometimes you get stuck going down this other path because of somebody's deal, or somebody doesn't want to look like they failed. So I've seen huge amounts of money wasted on enterprise level things that were just kind of dumb because they've already made those decisions.
There's a lot of really bad software that Enterprise uses that I've seen that it's just horrible, but because it's not open source, and it's, even if it's not like an internal project, but it's like they're paying someone for the CMS, and the CMS is complete garbage. Mm-hmm. They still refuse to go open source. They would still refuse to use WordPress, even though it's a much better experience for, let's say, their content editors. Which almost makes me think that if you were to like repackage WordPress but not actually do anything different, and then sell it for thousands of dollars per user per month, you'd almost have a better sell to Enterprise than just saying, okay, I'm going to use WordPress.
Yeah, I got a couple things to say about that. What Carl was saying is kind of right. I will say about 5 years ago, there was a big stigma around open source, and everyone's like, I need to own this. We have to have all the rights to it. I need the contract saying I own this code. It's mine. And then explain this to someone that's open source. I don't even own the code. Yeah. No one owns that. But I don't
remember having to go through legal departments. I'm sure you had to, like, just wanted to use some open source code, and they were like, okay, we need to go through, like, send us the license. We need to send us the legal. Like, yeah. Now they're like, whatever.
Yeah, it definitely has been more lax lately with that, and I would say the rest of the open source stuff. I don't know. I think it really just comes down to um, communicating with them and being in the right place at the right time. But I would say our biggest problem with getting WordPress into enterprise isn't the software. I think it's the developers. I think it's the skill set the developer needs to have in order to stay reputable with an agency. Because I know this is like a podcast we talked about a couple weeks ago, I believe, but I wasn't on that. But from a standpoint of just a skill set, like a corporate 500 company, a Fortune 500 company, or someone that's more enterprise, they're going to want a dev that is a legitimate dev that might have some certifications. They want proof. Uh, and I don't want to offend someone, but your average person that calls themselves a WordPress developer isn't really a developer. They've learned how to use WordPress, or they've been self-taught, and that then a corporate environment without the full know-how, that can be very scary to a larger company.
I think this is like really a really good tangent. I'm not super sold on certification. Like, I'm a really big self-taught guy. I know Tanya's been trying to do certification with WordPress, and it hasn't been super successful. I don't think certification is really the answer, but I think that the expectation and the bar of a like enterprise dev has to be way higher than what most WordPress devs do. Like, you need tooling, like things like having like continuous integration, like making sure like your code is good, like it's documented, it's, like you're not using variable A, like just having good work ethics, like not ghosting on you can't ghost an enterprise client, like things like that, right? Like, there's a code quality bar, there's a who you are as a developer bar too, that just needs to be higher with enterprise, because some of it is just because you're in a more professional context, but also you're just dealing with more people. Like, things that we haven't talked about is like sometimes you'll just ship code and you will have no impact on the deployment of that code. Like, that's one of the reasons why like updates is tricky, because if you update code, then sometimes they'll be like, okay, well, it has to go through security screening or stuff like that. But if you just update, just make a fix or something like that, they won't care, things like that. So like being on top of that, having that kind of professional, like unit testing, like all sorts of testing is important in enterprise. You want to be able to guarantee the client, like, okay, like this is going to keep running. We can tell you that this is going to keep running. We have fail-safe in place to let you know, like, okay, something broke, things like that. Those are all things that most WordPress devs either don't want to do, aren't familiar with. I mean, even at Automatic, like Automatic does not test code like to what I consider like enterprise level standards. Like, they're an enterprise company, but like the level of testing that they do to me is not representative of what I would expect for somebody of that size running this much of the internet on their platform, for example. But a lot of enterprise companies will require that. Like somebody like Disney or like anybody else would have like ridiculous amount of testing. Like if you read like what goes on like at like GitHub or something like that, like for code to go out, like it's on a completely different scale technically, and like from a robustness standpoint as well, of how things go. Like you can't run a company like Stripe with the same quality of development that most WordPress devs do. Like you need to be one step up for sure. That's one thing that's missing.
So I totally agree. I think that maybe the average WordPress developer, or the average person who calls themselves a WordPress developer, might not be up to par. Do you think that same analogy or that same comparison could be said about the platform itself? Like look at some of the more new age, forget JavaScript for a second, but if you look at like Laravel, right? It uses more of the fundamentals of a larger application platform, that WordPress doesn't use at all. So don't you think that on some level, WordPress itself might be causing that? Like, if you say, "Hey, I need a higher level of developer,"
Of course,
couldn't you?
I 100% believe that.
Couldn't you also say, "I need a higher level of platform"?
Yeah, I wrote.
And
I think WordPress doesn't teach you to be a good dev, like at least from an enterprise standpoint. Like,
Well, I'm just saying, like you say, enterprise needs a higher level developer. I totally agree. I work with developers, or the developers I work with are of higher level most of the time compared to like some of the average WordPress developers I'll meet at a WordCamp. Um, that being said, couldn't you also say, hey, because we need a higher level of developer, we also need a higher level of platform? And the top level of WordPress as a platform, well, there is no WordPress as a platform, really, not yet. I mean, people are kind of using it as such sometimes.
that's a bit of a tangential topic. I think WordPress as a platform is fine. I mean, for usage, like from a user, like from a person using WordPress on a daily basis, it's fine. From a developer standpoint, I mean, that's another issue entirely. I mean, WordPress is like over a decade old. Laravel does not have that same, doesn't have the same age as WordPress, and also just doesn't carry along. Again, the backwards compatibility stuff brings with it a certain amount of baggage, which also means more developer expertise, which sometimes the WordPress core team doesn't always have, like, which makes things like this tricky. And that's why you get statements like, oh, Gutenberg is a way to clear, to move on and leave our stuff behind. And I'm like, that's not really what happens in enterprise. They don't just arrive and say like, oh, we're just going to rebuild this and leave like this rotting core behind. Like, they have to be able to maintain it. Like, banking institutions run on COBOL. They have code that runs on COBOL, and it runs, and they maintain it. And you have to be able to maintain that software as well. So that comes with the context as well.
I'd say with enterprise, you actually get more often than not a rebuild. And while it needs to maintain its banking is almost another level, because banking is, again, way up there, super security, a lot of transactions, things like that. But I'd say if you're talking about like an enterprise application, you're more often to see a complete rebuild, right? Like from the ground up, that yes, needs to make sure it meets it doesn't impact business, right? Like that business can continue going as they have been. But I'd say that you could see enterprise completely drop something and be like, all right, it's like this doesn't exist anymore, but the way that we're continuing is going to be smooth. But like all the code, but all the code could be brand new. Like every line of code could be brand new.
I mean, yes, but I don't think for like large scale systems you would wholesale replace a system. Like, it depends, right? Like if it's a WordPress site, sure, like drop it. Like if it's a larger subsystem, like you can't just always drop it like that. Like sometimes there's with it.
Okay, bringing it back on topic for a second. Sorry, James. Open source. I don't know. I think one of the main things I love about open source, and something I tell everyone who complains about it, and again, most people that complain about it, we say in the last 5 years, it's really been a lot better. We're talking about people who are CIOs, CTOs that haven't been really learning anything, most likely, or just sticking to their enterprise like conferences and stuff like that, their enterprise tech for the last like 10, 15, 20 years. The good thing about open source is that when you look at resources, right, and again, we're talking about budget, you can spend a lot less of that budget maintaining code versus building new features. So if you're an enterprise and you're worried about profits, which most of them are, you can spend more of your resource, and that's money, building new features that bring in more money versus just keeping the code maintained, is what I'm saying. Like, if you're not using an open source thing, most likely you're either going to a company, right, that has a horrible solution. And more often than not, I actually see well, probably not more often, but about 50% of the time I see custom development instead. And custom development is ultimately like, okay, now we have to not just build this thing, but for the life cycle of it, we're going to have to maintain it. So again, this is where like a lot of legacy stuff kind of lives on, but it is what it is. Like you build an application for someone internally, you're going to have to keep on maintaining it. With open source, you kind of don't have that because you have a community of people maintaining it for you without actually paying them.
So I have another question based off of this. If we're trying to get WordPress into the enterprise world more often, do you think that should come from maybe Automatic attending more trade shows, or more like enterprise style trade shows? Does that mean agencies should be going out and also buying booths and spending $20,000 getting the WordPress brand out there for the greater good for everyone else to have a booth? Are we just not out there promoting to that market as a whole under brand awareness? So therefore, it goes to something more like Drupal or something else. Like,
I don't know if, again, I don't really know if the other like Laravel or Drupal are really doing it. I feel like that kind of comes from developers up. But oh yeah, I would love to see Automatic, have a booth at a large trade show, which like my CTO would end up attending. But Automatic's not selling to enterprise; they're selling to consumers. That's not Automatic's business model. Maybe VIP on some level, but
I think that's kind of a crutch or kind of a problem where it's like it's not like I know that I want to get work for myself, but I can't market for everyone to say, hey, WordPress is great for enterprise. You should work with all these enterprise developers when everyone is a small agency trying to just continue to find the next client. And then even like the WordPress itself, what you're absolutely correct, its focus is not that. So who's supposed to take on that burden to market more? Or is that more we should all learn to play golf and like to drink martinis and stuff and just go rub elbows with all these people, say, hey, have you heard WordPress? Let me buy you this round. Like, I mean,
I'm not even sure that, like, I'd be really surprised to hear of a CTO or as high up as possible who's just not heard of WordPress. Like, WordPress, what's that? I'm sure, like, for every person who doesn't want to use WordPress as like a enterprise level tool, probably has a WordPress site running their own blog somewhere, or at some point did, or their kid's blog or something. It'd be really weird to have to meet someone. I'd love to meet someone who's never heard of WordPress because I think it'd be fun. But I don't think anyone at this point hasn't heard of it. I mean, it's not impossible, but
I will say a lot of our enterprise level work all started because they had a project they needed done faster, or they had a side project and they know they had a small budget. And if they stayed under a budget restraint, they didn't have to get approval. So they would outsource that to a WordPress agency and just spin up the project really fast. Or a lot of times, large corporations will use WordPress as their intranet, like internally. So that even though these large companies, enterprise companies, might not always use WordPress as their main site, their chances are they are using it as an internal thing or a blog or a standalone marketing campaign somewhere. And they have small little niche departments that handle it. But I would love to see it be the main site, especially with all the new API stuff coming. You're not limited to the structure and the calls that WordPress is. You can kind of do whatever you want. I still see there being a scaling caching issue as people like what Carl said earlier. You have like someone like Time Warner with that many concurrent users on something, not Time Warner, but Times. WordPress itself out of the box does have a little bit of a problem with scaling, but it's not that we can't fix that or know how to do it. It's just someone that's only been using WordPress briefly won't know how to set up those servers correctly or how to share databases and make
but
work.
With enterprise, it's not rare, but it's not super common that someone who's working on, let's say, front end code or even like building out a WordPress plugin would be touching the server stack. Like, while full stack engineers exist and the need is there, there's usually always a dedicated like team for tech ops, just like there's a dedicated team for security. Like, so, and that's a great thing. It's another selling point about WordPress. Like, a main concern is a lot of times performance, as you said, or security, since it's so far out there. But with like mitigation, if you're not doing security on your other sites, like if you're enterprise, like if you're Times, right, the New York Times or whatever, and you have a non-WordPress site, I'm sure people are going to try to hack it all the freaking time. So you're going to have a security team or a tech ops team that's working with security to mitigate that. Apply that same thing to WordPress, like a WordPress site, and it'll be secure and safe. Like, you won't have to worry about it. Like, I don't understand that necessarily, that notion of, okay, WordPress is so far out there, it's like the IE of, website platform. But if you have a security team, which most enterprise levels, enterprise do, then that'll be mitigated. Same with tech ops, as far as, performance goes. You have other sites already that need performance. Tech ops is going to be handling that. So, honestly, it's like, while I understand most of that kind of stuff in my day-to-day, I don't have to worry about it too much. The only thing I have to worry about, which is, again, we talked about this with Carl, is I have to write good code. And that's ultimately what comes down to, because ultimately the application code is on my responsibility. And if the application code is not performant, then that's actually something I can fix and should fix. That's about it. Like, caching, all that kind of stuff, there's a whole nother team that handles all that.
And that is definitely some very valid points. You're not alone when you get to the enterprise level. You're not, a lot of times too, it's weird when you're working like that, like you hand off, like you said earlier, a lot of times we would never deploy our code. It's behind an intranet, or it's behind we can't even see it because our IPs aren't there. We're not, like, we did some work for some phone companies in Canada. Like, we can't even get to their servers. We test on ours, we deploy, make sure everything works, we give them a final package and instructions, and they handle it from there. So it's, but the one thing I do want to bring up, and I apologize if I misled, I by no means do I think WordPress is insecure. I think that anything with this much usage will always find vulnerabilities. And I think that is probably a huge problem with enterprise, is because, let's say, I think it was closer to like 8 years ago now, WordPress went through a couple security patches, and everyone's like, oh, WordPress is dangerous, it's not secure. And it's really just due to people not updating. And since then, we fixed a lot of those issues. For years, we fixed those issues, but I still think the community as a whole is still fighting that stigma from years ago, where people were always claiming that it's not safe. And I don't think it was ever not safe. I think it was just people being lazy who didn't update when we found vulnerabilities, which created that false environment of security issues, which is still a problem, but they could have updated and fixed it.
Yeah, ultimately we're going to face a lot of challenges because WordPress does power so much of the internet. And because of that, there's going to be a lot of people who want to find every single WordPress site and find vulnerabilities and then attack them. But in the enterprise realm, again, unless you're some small team, for the most part, you're going to have mitigation for all that. So if you just apply the same fundamentals, you should be fine. I'm going to wrap it up there. Sorry, I wanted to talk more about like combating some of this enterprise stuff, but I think we had a good conversation anyway. I think in a nutshell, no matter what someone says, maybe negatively from the enterprise about WordPress, the best way maybe to elevate WordPress to enterprise and show them that, hey, this is a good platform that we can use to build stuff, might be as, honestly, if WordPress as a whole is us developers leveled ourselves up and continue to level ourselves up. Like, I can't imagine if I needed to hire a developer for our team to do consulting work, that if I showed them Carl's work, they'd be like, no, this guy is not good, because his code speaks for itself. And that's what enterprise wants. They want good developers. And, Carl made a good point with that. And I think if more and more developers in the WordPress realm don't leave WordPress once they get good, and show that WordPress itself is a platform that can kind of house good developers, then it's going to be an easier sell for all of enterprise across the board.
Yeah, and tool development. That's why, like, there's me, there's Alain, which I like a lot, who does a lot of enterprise work. He does, I believe, mostly actually enterprise work. I don't know if it's only with WordPress, but a lot of it is with WordPress. And he has like a whole wall of libraries that he's built too for dealing with enterprise, reusing code, like really abstracting everything away. So it's really nice and tested and, you know, all that.
Yeah, no, and I don't want to give off the notion that WordPress isn't being used in enterprise currently, because it is. It's just not as much adopted as it should be, or as it can be. And so I think that's honestly, as if anything, like as James said, who's supposed to be marketing it? It's going to be us. It's going to be developers that are on the higher level doing work and showing off that WordPress can do really cool things to enterprise. So other enterprise people see, hey, this was built with WordPress with a really good team. We can actually build what we want with WordPress. Like, that's ultimately what's going to sell WordPress to more enterprises, having good developers building cool stuff with WordPress. And honestly, half the time, no one's going to know. Like, all these internal tools, I've seen some that are currently being built for my company I work for, and you would never know it's WordPress. I mean, I know because I can see the code, but otherwise it doesn't look like a blog site or anything, so you wouldn't assume. But that's what it is.
I would say a third of our work doesn't even care. They don't ask what we're building it. They say, we want this, we need this done, and what should we do? And the fact that we're using WordPress is that's just a line item. It's a tool in what we're building.
Yeah, and I think that's where enterprise is adopting it right now. But there's still a gap between people who don't care and then there's people who do care. Mm-hmm. And once the people who do care are okay with using WordPress, then I think we hit that next leaping point where, again, WordPress developers can start getting paid more again, and agencies will start getting paid more because they can actually sell larger, more expensive projects, things like that. So, cool. I'm going to end it there. As usual, please like the video, subscribe, and leave comments below in YouTube or on our WP Crowd page what you guys think. Like, how can WordPress really get farther into the enterprise realm? And what are things that you might have faced challenge-wise, and how did you combat that? I'm really curious to see what the rest of the community thinks. And I know that there is enterprise work out there with WordPress. So I'm curious how other people have gotten it and how any hurdles they might have faced. So like, comment, and then finally subscribe to our videos on YouTube, because we try to release as often as we can. Cool. I will see you guys next week. Thank you for joining.